They called them disgusting, shameful even. What if the meals we mocked held the flavors of a forgotten rebellion, and we only remembered too late? Ham and bananas hollandaise. It sounds like a prank, but in 1970s kitchens, this was a real dish served with pride. You take bananas, yes, actual sweet bananas, wrap them in slices of ham, smother the whole thing in hollandaise sauce, and bake it in the oven. What comes out is a warm, slippery bundle of confusion. The saltiness of the ham clashes with the tropical sweetness, while the hollandaise acts like a rich referee trying to make sense of it all. Housewives clipped it from trusted magazines, proudly served it to guests, then watched their reactions with quiet anxiety. It was a time when experimentation was encouraged, and what was once mocked could later be loved. Strangely, some came to crave the odd balance of savory and sweet. Others still gag at the thought. But this dish asked a question that haunted an entire era of cooking. What happens when you stop trying to impress and just get weird? Seafood mousse was the dinner table's dare. It looked fancy, often shaped like a fish with sliced olives for eyes and parsley for gills. But one spoonful and the illusion melted away. Inside was a cold, wobbly blend of pureed shrimp or crab, mayonnaise, cream, and gelatin, what some called elegance and others called edible punishment. You could taste the ambition. It wanted to be haute cuisine, like something you would serve in a yacht's dining room. But in the harsh light of a fluorescent kitchen, it was just sea-flavored pudding. Still, there was something brave about it. Back then, convenience foods met gourmet dreams, and the result was often terrifying. Yet, those who grew up with it remember the ritual, unmolding it carefully, smoothing out cracks, watching their mother beam with pride. You either laughed, cried, or politely swallowed. Today, you might find it ironically served at retro dinner parties or reimagined by daring chefs. But when you strip away the irony, what you have is a relic from a time when appearance mattered more than flavor, and gelatin held the world together. Candle salad was innocent on the surface, but anyone who saw it lit up with a smirk. Take a banana, stick it upright into a ring of pineapple, dollop on some mayonnaise, and top it with a cherry. It looked like a lit candle if you squinted, or something wildly inappropriate if you did not. Served mostly to children in etiquette books and family magazines, it was supposed to teach kids how to enjoy fruit while learning table manners. But instead, it became an ongoing joke passed down through generations. Parents would giggle behind their hands, and kids would blush as they poked it with a fork. Despite the giggles, it stuck around for years because in the 1970s, food was supposed to be fun, colorful, and conversation-starting, even if that conversation was mostly laughter. Somehow, even with mayonnaise slathered over fruit, this dish had charm. And maybe, in a decade that was desperately trying to balance wholesomeness with flair, candle salad was the perfect metaphor. Awkward, a little misunderstood, but weirdly memorable. Bologna cake was the culinary cousin of the practical joke. A tall stack of cold Bologna slices layered with seasoned cream cheese, then frosted like a birthday cake with more cream cheese or even spray cheese. Often decorated with pimentos or olives, it sat on party tables daring someone to slice in, and someone always did. For the working-class family, this was affordable showmanship. Bologna was cheap, cream cheese was easy, and together they made something that looked impressive until you tasted it. The salty, meaty cold layers fought the tangy spread, leaving your mouth confused and your guests polite. But there was pride in the creation. It showed you could take cheap ingredients and do something unexpected. Sometimes it was made as a joke, other times with total sincerity. Either way, it reflected the 1970s desire to break rules and blur boundaries between sweet and savory, food and art, joke and tradition. Few dishes have made people laugh, cringe, and ask for the recipe all in the same breath. But this one did. Porcupine meatballs were born out of thrift and genius. Take ground beef, mix it with uncooked rice, form them into balls, and cook them until the rice pokes through like tiny quills. The result looked like something between a hedgehog and a leftover miracle. These were not just clever, they were survival food. The rice stretched the meat farther, meaning families could feed more mouths for fewer dollars. Simmered in tomato sauce or baked in a casserole dish, they were warm, soft, and surprisingly satisfying. Every bite felt like something that was supposed to comfort you during hard times. Unlike some of the more theatrical dishes of the decade, Porcupine meatballs were humble, filling, and easy to love. Kids liked the name, adults liked the savings, and everyone liked the way they tasted. They might not be as weird as gelatin-based seafood, but they told a quieter story, one of making do, stretching dollars, and still finding ways to bring people together around a table. In their simplicity, they had strength. Lime cheese salad was the green mystery on many tables. Made with lime gelatin, cottage cheese, crushed pineapple, and sometimes shredded carrots or celery, it looked like dessert but tasted like something that belonged in a Tupperware experiment. The texture was wet and lumpy, sweet and salty, all at once. It was not trying to be liked. It demanded to be accepted. You could find it in church potlucks, holiday buffets, and neighborhood barbecues, sitting confidently between the potato salad and baked beans. Nobody was quite sure if it was an appetizer or a dessert, but they served it anyway. The cottage cheese added a richness that confused the palate, and the lime gelatin made sure you never forgot it. But in its weird way, it had heart. This was food made for gatherings, not Instagram. It was from a time when nobody cared how photogenic dinner was. They just cared that you showed up. Today, lime cheese salad is a reminder that taste is relative, and sometimes tradition means honoring the recipes that made us squirm and smile. 7UP. Salad felt like dessert had a soda-fueled meltdown. Lemon-lime gelatin, 7UP soda, crushed pineapple, miniature marshmallows, and sometimes nuts. It sparkled, jiggled, and made kids shriek with delight. It was the sugary cousin of ambrosia and the chaotic older sibling of fruit cocktail. Served in glass dishes with whipped topping and maraschino cherries, it was a staple of every school potluck and Sunday picnic. The soda gave it a fizzy tang, while the gelatin locked everything in like edible stained glass. For adults, it was cloying. For kids, it was magic. But the strange part was how seriously it was taken. Family recipe cards preserved it like treasure. Some grandmothers swore by a dash of lemon zest or the perfect marshmallow ratio. It blurred the line between salad and dessert until nobody remembered where it started. Was it good? Maybe. Was it unforgettable? Absolutely. 7UP Salad lives on as a sugary time capsule, sparkling with nostalgia, daring you to take a bite and remember when flavor was about fun, not judgment. Aspic salad was not food, it was sculpture. Clear gelatin made from meat or vegetable stock, encasing chunks of ham, eggs, olives, peas, or whatever was on hand. It wobbled with dignity, like something rescued from a Cold War science lab. And yet, it was served with pride. This was upscale hospitality, the kind that said you cared enough to use real gelatin instead of a box of lime JellO. It was cold, firm, and savory, a meat-flavored jelly with no apologies. People sliced it like cake, carefully plating wedges next to iceberg lettuce and a scoop of cottage cheese. You did not eat aspic for pleasure. You ate it because it was a symbol of effort, of decorum, of making something elegant when times were uncertain. Some say it died for good reason, but others still defend it, remembering the labor it took and the weird, soothing taste of chicken suspended in gel. It was the strange beauty of restraint and resourcefulness, and in the silence of those perfectly set molds, you could hear an entire generation trying to impress. Frosted sandwich loaf was a cake in disguise, and its secret was savory. Layers of white bread spread with fillings like egg salad, ham salad, and chicken salad, stacked high and then frosted with tinted cream cheese. It looked like dessert, but tasted like the lunch table. Often decorated with pimento slices or parsley, it dazzled guests before bewildering them. Cutting into it revealed pastel-colored layers, each with its own texture and flavor. This was not just food, it was performance. Perfect for bridal showers, ladies' luncheons, and retro picnics, it was the 1970s answer to edible art. Mothers made them with pride. Daughters smiled politely. Husbands asked for seconds, sometimes out of curiosity more than hunger. It was not about flavor, it was about presentation. This dish existed in a brief moment when domestic creativity met culinary chaos. And while it rarely appears today, those who remember it do not forget it. It was bold. It was strange. It was the sandwich that wanted to be a cake and almost got away with it. Jellied chicken salad was cold comfort in molded form. Chopped cooked chicken, celery, pimentos, and olives set in a gelatin base flavored with chicken broth. It jiggled with every movement and released a savory aroma that clashed with its dessert-like appearance. Served in ring molds or bundt shapes, it sat on beds of iceberg lettuce like royalty. For some, it was nostalgic bliss. For others, it was dinner trauma. But this was what 1970s cuisine was about: stretching ingredients, making meals ahead of time, and showing off just a little. The chicken gave it substance, the gelatin gave it longevity, and the mold gave it flair. Families served it at potlucks and holidays, slicing cold slabs like meat jelly pie. It confused taste buds and sparked arguments. But it also reminded people of family, tradition, and the strange comfort of a dish that dared to be both elegant and bizarre. In every wiggly bite was a story, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of love. There was something ceremonious about the way it jiggled. Molded vegetable salad wasn't just a side dish, it was centerpiece theater. A ring of lime or tomato gelatin captured peas, carrots, celery, and sometimes even olives, suspended mid-wiggle like they were caught in a culinary time warp. Housewives of the 50s and 60s believed this was the epitome of presentation. Nutrition locked inside shimmering, fruit-colored architecture, it showed off your fridge and your social status. Was it good? That depends on whether you enjoyed the experience of biting into sweet gelatin only to hit a green bean. The mouth couldn't quite decide if it was being treated or punished. At church potlucks, it gleamed under fluorescent lights next to potato salads and deviled eggs. Kids poked it. Adults took polite slivers. And someone's aunt always said it reminded her of something she saw in Good Housekeeping. Molded vegetable salad was a fever dream of food science, made by those brave enough to ignore texture clashes in the name of spectacle. And yet, behind its quivering form lay an odd kind of pride. This was the future of food, or at least that's what they hoped. Spam fritters were the working man's answer to a fried indulgence. Slice a block of Spam, thick, proud pink, and dip it in a simple flour and egg batter, then drop it into hot oil until it hissed and blistered golden. Out came a crisp shell hiding soft, salty meat. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, hearty, and quick. In post-war kitchens where money was thin and time was precious, Spam was both a blessing and a joke. The fritters made it feel more like a treat. British households particularly embraced it during rationing, serving it with mashed potatoes or wrapped in paper like fish and chips. In American homes, it showed up in lunchboxes next to a thermos of tomato soup. Kids might have groaned at the sight, but they ate it anyway. It was salty, greasy, and satisfying in the way only fried things can be. Sometimes it even masqueraded as dinner at a Friday night table, alongside canned peas and a scoop of instant mashed potatoes. You didn't eat Spam fritters because you loved Spam. You ate them because they filled your stomach and made you forget for a moment what you couldn't afford. Tuna noodle casserole was a dish stitched together from pantry leftovers and wartime wisdom. A can of tuna, a bag of egg noodles, and that mysterious glop of cream of mushroom soup. Top it with breadcrumbs or crushed potato chips, slide it into the oven, and wait until the corners start to crisp. It was the sound of stretching a paycheck, the smell of Tuesday night, the kind of dish that fed 5 for the price of 1. It showed up in PTA newsletters and Betty Crocker cookbooks, often under the name Easy Family Favorite. But even the kids knew better. The creamy gray sauce, the slippery noodles, the fishy undertone, it wasn't exactly restaurant fare. Yet there was something comforting about it, like a wool sweater you wouldn't wear in public but couldn't throw away. Moms swore by it, dads asked for seconds, and when you were sick, it tasted like effort, because behind every spoonful was someone trying to do their best with what they had. Tuna noodle casserole wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. It was warm, dependable, and just slightly sad in the way only mid-century meals could be. Chicken a la king always sounded fancier than it was. The name suggested royalty, maybe even candlelight, but in practice, it was diced chicken swimming in a thick cream sauce speckled with peas, pimentos, and mushrooms spooned over toast or rice. It wasn't so much a king's meal as it was what his accountant might eat at a church luncheon. Yet, in the 1950s, it was a dinner party darling. You could whip it up with canned soup and leftover chicken, and suddenly your guests felt like they were somewhere special, if only for a moment. It had an elegance that came from effort rather than expense. Housewives folded in evaporated milk with precision, balancing salt and richness with the same care they gave their lipstick. Kids picked out the mushrooms, husbands sprinkled on pepper. And everyone agreed it beat Meatloaf for the third night in a row. Chicken a la king wasn't really about the chicken, it was about pretending. Pretending you weren't scraping by, pretending your kitchen was a restaurant, pretending a ladle of creamy sauce could elevate anything, and for many it did. At least until the leftovers ran out. Beef Stroganov brought a whisper of Russian elegance to the American table, even if that whisper was drowned out by canned soup and elbow noodles. Originally a dish for czars, it was reborn in the post-war Midwest with a box of pasta and a tub of sour cream. Strips of beef, sometimes sirloin, sometimes mystery meat, were sautéed until just brown, then smothered in a thick, tangy sauce. The noodles soaked up the flavor like sponges, and the result was rich, filling, and oddly beige. Still, it was exotic enough to feel special. It said you knew your way around a cookbook, even if you'd never been farther than Cleveland. Mom served it with pride. Kids scarfed it down without complaint, and husbands asked where you learned to make something so European. It showed up at bridge clubs, funeral potlucks, and every third Tuesday dinner. There were better meals, sure, but few were so consistently edible. Beef stroganoff was comfort in casserole form, sour, creamy, and unapologetically heavy. It wasn't authentic, it wasn't gourmet, but it had heart, and for a dish made mostly from shortcuts, that was saying something. Deviled ham lived in a can with a key you twisted like a secret. It was pink, pasty, and looked like something between meat and mystery. But when you mixed it with mayonnaise and a bit of mustard, it transformed into the lunch of champions, or at least survivors. Spread it between 2 slices of white bread, maybe with a pickle or iceberg lettuce, and you had a sandwich that tasted like 1953. The deviled part came from the addition of spice, though in truth it was rarely more daring than paprika. It was salty, tangy, and relentlessly smooth. You could smear it on crackers or scoop it with celery, pretending it was pâté if you squinted hard enough. Moms packed it in school lunches with a note and a cookie. Grandmas kept a can in the back of the pantry just in case. It was a relic of rationing, a holdover from when waste wasn't an option. Deviled ham didn't aspire to be anything more than what it was, a humble, seasoned meat paste. And somehow, that was enough. Salmon Mousse was a pink, wobbly monument to culinary optimism. It arrived on a platter in the shape of a fish, its scales carefully detailed by a copper mold. Inside, pureed salmon, whipped with cream and held together with unflavored gelatin. Cold, smooth, and hauntingly oceanic. It was a staple of holiday buffets and garden luncheons, the kind of dish that required no chewing and even less questioning. Sprigs of parsley tried to make it look alive. Lemon slices hinted at freshness. But beneath it all was the taste of canned fish and ambition. Women's magazines called it elegant. Guests called it interesting. Children called it gross. And still, it reappeared year after year because it made you look like you tried. That was the real magic. Not the flavor, but the effort it implied. You didn't just open a can, you molded a vision. One that jiggled, glistened, and dared you to admire it. Salmon Mousse was never about appetite. It was about achievement. The cheese ball was the party's unspoken promise. This won't be fancy, but it will be filling. A snow globe of cheddar, cream cheese, and mystery spices rolled in crushed nuts or parsley, waiting patiently beside a ring of Ritz crackers. It showed up at every holiday gathering like an aunt who drank too much punch and told the same story every year. And yet, no one complained. The cheese ball was meant to be shared. Scooped with a knife or smashed with a chip, it was communal, greasy, and weirdly addictive. Some versions were sharp, others garlicky, and a few tasted like someone dropped ranch dressing into a cement mixer. But once it hit your tongue, you kept going. You had to. It was the law of nostalgia. Hostesses treated it like centerpiece art, shaping it into pine cones, pumpkins, or even snowmen. And somewhere between the second glass of wine and the eighth cracker, you realized this was the best thing on the table. The cheese ball never tried to be more than it was. That's why it was perfect. Meatloaf with hard-boiled eggs wasn't just food. It was a surprise in every slice. You'd bite in expecting the usual ground beef comfort, only to find a yellow eye staring back at you. The eggs, lined up like buried treasure, gave each portion a touch of visual drama and a little extra protein. It was a conversation piece on a plate. Housewives molded it with care, blending breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings into the beef before nestling those eggs right in the middle. Once baked and sliced, it revealed its striped secret like a magic trick. Some loved the combination, others found it suspicious. But it didn't matter. It was hearty, it was economical, and it made Tuesday night dinner feel just a bit more exciting. Served with ketchup, mashed potatoes, and green beans from a can, it filled the belly in the fridge. Leftovers always made a good sandwich. And while it never earned gourmet points, Meatloaf with hard-boiled eggs reminded you that even the humblest meals could hold surprises. Stuffed bell peppers were edible containers of culinary thrift. Bright red or green, they were hollowed out and crammed full of ground beef, rice, onions, and tomato sauce. The tops went back on like little hats, and then the whole thing baked until tender and slightly wrinkled. It was a one-stop shop of nutrients and nostalgia. Moms loved them for their simplicity. Kids tolerated them if there was enough cheese, and dads cut them in half like they were dissecting an experiment. The flavors blended into a warm, slightly sweet, slightly tangy mix that clung to your ribs and your memories. They weren't elegant, but they were honest. A working-class meal with just enough color to feel festive. In a world of casseroles and gelatin, stuffed bell peppers stood tall, literally. They were proof that you could make something beautiful out of the basics. Just meat, rice, and a vegetable turned centerpiece. A dinner you could eat with a fork and a story. Chicken divan was the kind of casserole that made you feel like royalty at a church potluck. It came bubbling out of the oven in a Pyrex dish, with layers of tender chicken and limp but loyal broccoli, all smothered in a thick, cheesy white sauce that was somehow both elegant and deeply indulgent. The top was golden, crusted with breadcrumbs and maybe a bit too much shredded cheddar, but nobody ever complained. Moms swore it was fancy, especially if you used sherry in the sauce, even though most just poured in cream of chicken soup and prayed no one asked questions. It was often the go-to for leftover poultry, or a gesture of hospitality when someone had a new baby or a death in the family. You'd find yourself standing in the kitchen, plate in hand, scraping off the last bits with a spoon, even though you were full halfway through. It was rich, warm, and oddly comforting, like the casserole equivalent of a reassuring pat on the back. Chicken divan didn't try to be trendy or modern. It simply asked for a can, a casserole dish, and a bit of quiet appreciation. And for that, we always came back for seconds. Eggplant Parmesan always came with a certain level of drama. You either loved it with deep, undying passion or avoided it like your aunt's fruitcake. The eggplant was sliced thin, sometimes salted and patted dry like an old ritual, then breaded and fried until it could pass for something heartier. Layered between tomato sauce and mozzarella, it was a gooey, bubbling masterpiece that filled the house with a scent that felt half Italian restaurant, half grandmother's kitchen. The top would always brown unevenly, with some bits crisp and others just shy of melted. You'd scoop it out with a spatula and watch the layers slide, hot and fragrant, onto your plate. It had no meat, but somehow nobody missed it. You'd hear someone at the table say, "I usually hate eggplant, but this is different." It was messy, always a bit too wet or too dry, but never just right, and that was part of its charm. It was comfort food dressed in marinara, proudly vegetarian but rich enough to pass as a main event, and it held court on the buffet table like it belonged there all along, unapologetically bold and beautifully imperfect. Quiche Lorraine was breakfast trying to be fancy and succeeding just enough to feel like a special occasion. It had a buttery crust, sometimes homemade but usually from a red Pillsbury box, cradling a golden custard of eggs, cream, and little flecks of bacon. The cheese, Gruyere if you were sophisticated, cheddar if you were practical, melted into silky submission. Served warm or cold, it was the kind of dish that looked effortless but whispered elegance. People would slice it like a pie, pausing to admire the soft wobble of the center before taking a bite. It made appearances at bridal showers, brunches with doilies, or on Sunday mornings when someone decided toast just wouldn't do. It was both light and rich, with a taste that lingered like a compliment you weren't sure you deserved. Even if the crust burned or the middle sagged, you'd still eat it with gratitude and a tiny fork. Beef Wellington was the kind of dish that entered a room with fanfare, even if that room was just your mother's kitchen. It was meat dressed for the opera, filet mignon swaddled in pâté and mushroom duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry so golden it looked like it had something to prove. This was not a Tuesday night meal. This was reserved for anniversaries, promotions, or holidays where someone brought out the silverware no one was allowed to put in the dishwasher. The slicing was ceremonial, one clean cut to reveal the pink center still steaming, surrounded by savory mushrooms and that flaky shell. It was rich, yes, but not in a greasy way. It was elegant, deliberate, and maybe a little over the top. And long after the plates were cleared, it lingered in memory like a small, edible miracle. Shrimp cocktail was an appetizer that thought it was a celebrity. It came chilled, dignified, and perfectly poised in those fluted glass dishes you only saw at weddings or 1980s dinner parties. The shrimp were always curled like little pink commas, perfectly arranged around the rim with their tails pointed just so, like a chorus line waiting for the music to start. At the center sat the cocktail sauce, ketchup and horseradish with just enough heat to remind you this wasn't kid food. It wasn't just about the flavor. It was about the ritual. The clink of crystal, the coolness of the shrimp, the bold zing of that first dip. Even if you were at a suburban gathering or a retro seafood chain, serving shrimp cocktail made the evening feel like something grand. It was a dish that didn't shout, it smirked. It didn't need reinvention, only reverence. It was fancy without being fussy. Shrimp cocktail didn't try to prove itself. It had already arrived. It just needed a place at the table, next to the linen napkins and the chilled wine, where it could continue being the confident old-school starter it always was. Fondue was more than food. It was an activity, a mood, a social contract. The pot sat in the center, bubbling like a miniature volcano of melted cheese or glossy chocolate, depending on your audience. Everyone had a long, colored fork and a look of hopeful anticipation. Bread cubes went in first, toasted on the outside, but soft enough to soak up the gooey mess. Sometimes apples, sometimes little sausages, sometimes things you didn't know could be dipped. It was always communal, which meant double dipping was either strictly forbidden or casually ignored depending on how close you were to the other diners. There was always one person who lost their bread and tried to fish it out, turning the pot into an edible treasure hunt. Fondue wasn't about speed, it was about lingering. And long after the pot had cooled, the warmth of it stuck around. Stuffed celery was the awkward cousin at the appetizer table, unexpected but somehow always invited. It was humble, simple, and entirely dependent on what you filled it with. Cream cheese was the standard, whipped until fluffy and piped in like icing on a green log. Sometimes it came flecked with chives, olives, or those tiny packets of ranch mix you weren't supposed to use all at once. Other times, peanut butter took over, with raisins placed on top like edible polka dots, a dish better known as ants on a log. It was the kind of snack that made an appearance at baby showers and PTA meetings, sitting proudly among deviled eggs and Ritz crackers. It was nostalgia in a crisp bite, and for those who grew up with it, a strange little reminder that the simple things still matter. Ambrosia Salad was a bowl of dessert pretending to be a side dish, and nobody had the heart to call it out. It was sweet, fluffy, and suspiciously white, usually a mix of canned mandarin oranges, crushed pineapple, mini marshmallows, coconut flakes, and a generous heap of whipped topping or sour cream. It had the texture of a dream and the nutritional value of a birthday wish, but still it showed up at Easter and Thanksgiving like it belonged next to the green beans. It was pastel and soft, a sugar-laced throwback to the days when JellO reigned supreme and fruit salad didn't have to be fresh. Every scoop was a gamble. Would you get a juicy piece of orange or a surprise cherry? It didn't matter. In a world of kale and quinoa, it still waved its marshmallow flag proudly. Watergate salad was one of those dishes that made you squint at the recipe and think, really? Pistachio pudding, canned pineapple, whipped topping, and marshmallows, all mixed together in a shade of green not found in nature. And yet, there it was at every potluck, nestled between the JellO mold and the baked beans, glowing like a pastel alien artifact. It was called a salad, but no lettuce dared show its face near this thing. It was creamy, sweet, and suspiciously addictive. Kids flocked to it like bees to soda cans. Adults made excuses before they took a scoop, then circled back for seconds. Nobody quite knew why it was called Watergate Salad, maybe to distract you from asking more questions. It was retro comfort at its most unapologetic. And in a world that keeps trying to reinvent the wheel, Watergate Salad just smiled and stayed exactly the same. Chicken cacciatore was rustic in all the best ways. It meant hunter's chicken, but you didn't have to be out in the woods to enjoy it. Just someone with a skillet, a few herbs, and a lot of patience. The chicken simmered in a tomato-based sauce with onions, peppers, garlic, and sometimes mushrooms, filling the house with the kind of smell that made you stop and breathe it in. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a real meal. Something slow-cooked and soulful, spooned over rice or noodles or maybe just soaked up with bread. The sauce was always the star, tangy and rich, with flavors that deepened the longer it simmered. You didn't need a recipe, just instinct and maybe a splash of wine if the mood struck. And long after the plates were cleared, it left behind a quiet kind of satisfaction. A household staple for decades, canned tuna was a go-to choice for quick meals and affordable protein. Packed with convenience and a mild flavor that fit everything from sandwiches to casseroles, its popularity surged throughout the 20th century. But hidden beneath its silver lid was an ingredient no one had bargained for: mercury. Some brands of tuna contained alarmingly high levels of the toxic metal, a risk that went largely unnoticed in the 1960s when food safety regulations had yet to catch up with modern science. Back then, concerns over contaminants weren't front-page news. The average consumer had little reason to suspect that a simple tuna salad might come with a side of neurological damage. Mercury, a heavy metal that can accumulate in the body, posed serious health risks, especially for pregnant women and young children. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included cognitive impairments, muscle weakness, and developmental issues, hardly what anyone expected from a lunchtime staple. As research progressed, regulatory agencies stepped in. By the 1970s, the FDA began imposing stricter limits on mercury levels in seafood, and today, guidelines recommend limiting the consumption of certain fish. Red dye number 2, or otherwise known as Amaranth, was actually one of the most popular artificial food colorings ever produced. If you ever had candy, soda, processed meat, hell, if you bought certain kinds of makeup, there were high chances this was either on your skin or in your system. Now, normally, people didn't care too much about it. I mean, it's the 50s, that's kind of on brand for the time period, right? And why would they? It was resistant to heat, it could be used in liquid form and powder, it was a lot cheaper, easy to produce in bulk, it could be used with everything, and the color was just spectacular. So some of you might immediately express a lot of enthusiasm after hearing that. But some of you might think, what's the catch? Raise a suspicious eyebrow, or just think that this is too good to be true. And you'd be exactly right. The Food and Drugs Administration outlawed Amaranth in around 1976, because studies had suggested that it actually increased the chances of cancer. Scientists had begun to link potential carcinogenic effects, and Amaranth in particular came under scrutiny. There were all sorts of rumors about it. From your head to your toes, it could give you tumors anywhere like mosquitoes give you rashes. This pretty much sealed the deal for the industry, and as they wanted to get ahead of the issue, the ban became a pretty clear solution. By the 1970s, the diet food industry was booming. With calorie counting in full swing, people were looking for ways to satisfy their sweet tooth without the guilt. Saccharine became the answer. Found in everything from diet sodas to sugar-free desserts, it was a game changer. Hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, yet with none of the calories. It didn't taste exactly like sugar, but for those determined to stay slim, it was close enough. Saccharine had actually been around since the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it took over the diet market. People stirred it into their coffee, poured it over cereal, and downed it in soft drinks like Tab. It was everywhere, until scientists started raising concerns. In the early 1970s, studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, setting off alarm bells. The FDA responded by mandating warning labels on products containing the sweetener, effectively scaring off a lot of consumers. Despite the controversy, saccharine never fully disappeared. Later research suggested the rat studies didn't translate directly to humans, and by 2000, the cancer warning was removed. Today, it's still around, though it competes with newer artificial sweeteners. Back then, though, it was the diet craze's best friend. Until it wasn't. Bright, bold, and eye-catching, color mattered in the 1960s food industry, and few additives were as widely used as Red No. 2 or Amaranth. From candies to cake frosting, this synthetic dye gave processed foods an irresistible vibrancy. It was cheap, effective, and made everything look more appealing. But what manufacturers saw as a marketing advantage, scientists would later recognize as a serious health risk. At the time, food dyes weren't scrutinized as heavily as they are today. The general belief was that if a product made it to store shelves, it had to be safe. Red No. 2 was everywhere, with little concern for long-term effects. But as research advanced, animal studies suggested a troubling connection between this popular dye and potential carcinogenic properties. Though the data wasn't conclusive for humans, the idea of a cancer-causing colorant lurking in everyday foods was enough to raise alarms. Public pressure mounted, and by the 1970s, the FDA banned Red No. 2 in the US, following similar actions in Europe. While other artificial dyes remained in use, this case marked a turning point in food safety regulations. Ketchup's near and dear to everyone's hearts, but most of us are used to it being red on its own. In the 50s, though, people actually bought artificially colored ketchup. This was completely red, almost obsessively so. In hindsight, it wasn't that odd for food colorings and synthetic dyes to be used, but towards the 50s, and particularly the end of the 50s, started using all kinds of strong dyes. There was an almost strange obsession with getting the perfect cherry red aesthetic for each ketchup company. All of them were doing this: Hunt's, Del Monte's, and even Heinz. They started to have it in just about every ketchup product they released. This one never really became illegal. It's still something they do to this day. But there definitely was a lot of demand for natural ketchup lately. I kind of get it. It's just a dip made out of tomatoes, so why bother making it extra red? These next few items are really going to take you for a spin. I mean, we've had horses and turtles so far, but these really come into the top 3. Mornings in the 1970s often started the same way. Parents sipping their coffee, kids getting ready for school, and, in many households, children drinking coffee right alongside the adults. It wasn't unusual. In fact, in some families it was encouraged, especially in certain cultural traditions where a little coffee with milk and sugar was considered perfectly fine for young ones. Some parents even believed it helped build character or made kids feel more grown up. Coffee for kids wasn't just about the caffeine, it was part of breakfast. Some children dunked their toast into it, while others drank a watered-down version, often loaded with sugar. It wasn't uncommon for grandparents to pour a little into a toddler's bottle, swearing it would keep them calm. an idea that hasn't exactly aged well. But as health studies evolved, concerns over caffeine's effects on developing bodies became harder to ignore. Doctors warned that regular consumption could stunt growth, interfere with sleep, and even lead to increased heart rates. While coffee itself was never banned for kids, the cultural norm slowly faded. Today, it's more likely to raise eyebrows than fill sippy cups. But back then, a cup of joe before school wasn't shocking. It was just part of growing up, one jittery sip at a time. Few scents are as instantly recognizable as the rich, buttery aroma of freshly popped popcorn. But in the mid-20th century, that unmistakable smell often came from a chemical rather than dairy. Artificial butter flavoring, or diacetyl, became a common ingredient in microwave popcorn, margarine, and other processed foods, offering an affordable way to mimic the real thing. At a time when convenience foods were on the rise, manufacturers saw it as a perfect shortcut, one that delivered full-flavored appeal without the cost of actual butter. But while diacetyl made foods taste richer, it also carried risks that wouldn't come to light for decades. In industrial settings, workers exposed to airborne diacetyl began developing severe respiratory illnesses, including a rare condition later dubbed popcorn lung. The name might sound cartoonish, but the effects were anything but. Prolonged exposure could cause irreversible lung damage, leading to chronic coughing and shortness of breath. Regulatory agencies eventually intervened, restricting its use in certain food production environments and mandating safer handling practices. While diacetyl is still found in some products today, many companies have removed or replaced it. Remember the unpasteurized raw milk? Well, people didn't just use it to drink. They ended up making farm cheese out of it too. It was commonly made in a lot of rural America, especially on family farms and within Amish communities throughout the nation. Safety regulations really weren't what they are now, as you can clearly tell by this point. Raw milk cheeses were considered a way to preserve dairy, while also working as a nice little topping for your meat. Plus, some of them even made enough of the stuff to sell, and they would market it as this all-natural product too. Back then, the dangers of consuming cheese made from unpasteurized milk just weren't well known. Also, this cheese was exceptionally rich and creamy. It had a stronger flavor too, and it would be even better depending on how aged it was. The best one was probably Colby or Jack cheese from the Midwest or California though. At least they were popular until they started causing salmonella, listeria, and brucellosis within the population. This led to a lot more proactive government intervention. The United States Department of Agriculture, for example, started to encourage pasteurization for most cheeses. Throughout the 50s, many states would ban the sale of this kind of cheese, and by the 70s, it got outlawed completely. For much of American history, wild game meat wasn't just for hunters, it was for sale. In rural areas, local butchers and roadside markets offered everything from venison to wild rabbit, often sourced straight from the woods. No USDA inspections, no government oversight, just the trust that if a guy in town sold it, it was good. And for many, it was. Fresh, lean, and often cheaper than store-bought beef, wild game was a practical option, especially when grocery store prices climbed. It was prepared just like any other meat. Venison roasts, rabbit stews, fried squirrel, whatever was available, people knew how to cook it. Some families had a deep knowledge of butchering and preserving, passed down for generations. But the problem wasn't always in how it was cooked, it was what might be lurking in the meat before it ever hit the pan. With no inspections, there was no way to guarantee wild game was free from disease, parasites, or contamination. By the late 20th century, regulations cracked down, requiring all commercially sold meat to go through USDA inspection. While personal hunting remains legal, selling wild game without certification is now largely banned. Long before tobacco was widely recognized as a public health hazard, it was used in ways that would raise eyebrows today. One of the strangest? Tobacco-flavored cough syrup. At a time when smoking was still being advertised by doctors and marketed as a remedy for stress, it wasn't all that shocking to find tobacco making its way into medicinal syrups. After all, if it was good enough for a cigarette, why not a sore throat? Throughout the early to mid-20th century, cough syrups were often packed with ingredients that, in hindsight, sound more like the makings of a problem than a cure. Some contained opiates, others had alcohol, and a few, incredibly, were infused with nicotine or tobacco extracts. The idea was that the plant's natural properties could help suppress coughs and open up airways. And while the logic might have sounded reasonable at the time, the reality was far from beneficial. By the 1960s and 70s, the tide had begun to turn against tobacco. Research linked it to lung disease, cancer, and addiction, and regulators cracked down. By the late 20th century, tobacco-flavored medicines had all but disappeared. Now, sassafras tea was a beverage that most people had considered a very old tradition. Despite that, you may have never heard of it. This was something you would most commonly see in the Appalachian regions and the rural South. Native Americans were the first ones to ever introduce the settlers to the plant, and it was a very popular folk medicine. A lot of Native Americans put a lot of stock in its fever-managing, blood-purifying qualities. Back then, fevers were just about as common as zits, so having handy little herbal remedies was a godsend. It was really cheap, it was always available, even in grocery stores and medicine shops, and it was very easy to make. You could get dried sassafras root and that was it. You might be surprised that people often had it with root beer, though. A pint of Hires or A&W along with your tried and tested root remedy was actually a pretty common pairing for people. Plus, traditional root beer recipes were made with sassafras, so that's also why it went together really well. It wasn't until studies found out that sassafras contained safrole in it, which is pretty harmful to your liver. Bright red candies, cherry-flavored snacks, and even some holiday treats in the 1970s owed their bold color to a single ingredient: red dye number 2. It was everywhere, from gumballs to cake frostings, giving sweets that signature vibrant hue that made them impossible to resist. At the time, artificial dyes were a standard part of food production, helping manufacturers make their products more visually appealing. After all, who wanted a dull pink candy when you could have a deep, fiery red one? The problem? Red dye. Number 2 wasn't as harmless as it looked. By the mid-1970s, scientific studies linked it to potential health risks, including concerns over carcinogenic effects. When Soviet researchers published findings suggesting a connection to cancer in lab rats, the US had no choice but to take a second look. Public concern mounted, and in 1976, the FDA banned the dye, triggering a nationwide panic. Some candy makers scrambled to find alternatives, while others simply pulled their red products from shelves altogether, resulting in the infamous disappearance of red M&Ms, even though they didn't actually contain the dye. Today, red dye number 2 is a thing of the past, but artificial food colorings are still debated. Processed meats have long been a fixture of the American diet, offering convenience, affordability, and a satisfying smoky flavor. But there was one key ingredient that made these meats last longer and look more appetizing: sodium nitrate. In the 1960s, it was used liberally in everything from bacon to hot dogs, ensuring bright red hues and extended shelf life. Few questioned what made their deli meat so vibrant, but as science advanced, concerns began to emerge. At the time, food preservation was a priority, and sodium nitrate was seen as a practical solution. It prevented bacterial growth and gave processed meats a signature cured taste. However, researchers later discovered a darker side. When exposed to high heat, sodium nitrate could form nitrosamines, compounds linked to cancer in animal studies. While a single ham sandwich wasn't a cause for alarm, a lifetime of consuming highly processed meats raised significant health concerns. By the 1970s, regulatory agencies stepped in, limiting nitrate levels and requiring careful monitoring. While still legal today in controlled amounts, many consumers now seek nitrate-free options. The story of sodium nitrate serves as a reminder that food science is constantly evolving. Funnily enough, Beluga caviar used to be pretty cheap. I mean, by the 50s, it was definitely a plaything of the uber elite, but it started out as a pretty cheap thing you could just get from sturgeon. It's kind of hard to imagine, right? The image we associate with it today started from upper-class culture, basically putting the thing on a pedestal. It didn't help that every establishment that was meant to cater to this exclusive class was also putting it on all of their menus. You had Beluga caviar on crackers with expensive champagne or chilled vodka with blini and creme fraiche. The possibilities were pretty endless. It became something you associate with old money, with diplomatic gatherings and big political events, and the kind of thing that was just too rich for the blood of an average worker. That's still true today, but hey, it's at least comforting to know that in some era, it used to be considered pretty cheap, almost unsavory, really. Do you get the hype? I mean, let's say you had the money to burn. Would you still be spending it on caviar? Not to impress a date or to hit a rich flex, just as a food. A crisp autumn day in the 1970s wasn't complete without a trip to the local farm stand. Fresh apples, homemade pies, and of course, a jug of unpasteurized apple cider, cloudy, rich, and straight from the press. It was a seasonal tradition, the kind of drink you poured into a glass and sipped cold, or warmed up on the stove with a cinnamon stick. No labels, no expiration dates, just fresh-pressed fruit in its purest form. For generations, farm-fresh juices were a staple, especially in rural areas where people trusted their local orchards. The juice was made by simply crushing fruit and collecting the liquid. No heat treatment, no extra processing, and because it wasn't filtered, it had that distinct, pulpy texture that store-bought juice just couldn't match. But as food safety research advanced, so did concerns over harmful bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. Unpasteurized juice, while natural, carried risks, especially for children and the elderly. By the 1990s, regulations tightened, requiring warning labels and, in many cases, pasteurization for commercial sale. While you can still find raw cider at some farm stands, it often comes with a disclaimer. In the mid-20th century, the agricultural industry was on a mission to maximize production, and antibiotics played a key role in that effort. One in particular, chloramphenicol, became a popular choice for keeping livestock healthy and increasing meat yields. Farmers saw it as an efficient way to prevent infections in crowded conditions, while food producers benefited from higher output. For a time, it seemed like a win-win, until scientists uncovered the serious health risks lurking beneath the surface. Unlike some antibiotics that merely disrupt digestion, chloramphenicol posed a far more alarming danger: aplastic anemia, a rare but potentially fatal condition where the body stops producing enough blood cells. The problem wasn't just with direct exposure. Traces of the antibiotic could linger in meat and dairy products, making their way onto dinner tables across the country. Consumers had no way of knowing that their Sunday roast might come with a side of medical complications. As evidence mounted, regulators took action. By the 1980s, chloramphenicol was banned in food production in many countries, including the United States. Today, strict testing ensures that no remnants make it into the food supply. Have you ever felt so hungry you thought you could take down a whole horse? Well, in the 1950s, that wasn't just a piece of hyperbole, it was a very literal statement. While horse meat never really rose to the heights a tenderloin steak or blue crabs did, it was something that people warmed up to more and more as economic strife and being a U.S. citizen started going hand in hand. Do you remember how we were just talking about trans fats being rooted in World War II-era food rationing strategies? Yeah, that whole period really induced a new way of thinking when it came to food. People were doubling down on making the most of whatever they had and opening their horizons to things they had previously been really dismissive of. Horse meat had a pretty bad reputation, especially since most Americans had a sentimental view of horses. They were pets. They were your next best friend after dogs, they were great workers, and they were beautiful animals you could write poetry about. I think we romanticize anything we can ride into the sunset. But anyway, horse meat started to become a pretty common alternative to beef. Butcher shops would even change the name to have an easier time selling it. But most people started to pick up on the fact that cheval wasn't really real meat. Plus, as technology developed and replaced traditional agricultural methods, a lot of farmers found that they had no real use for all the horses they had anymore. And, well, I know I said they were your second closest bestie, but you'd be surprised what people will do to have fewer mouths to feed, especially if it feeds their own in the process. In the 1970s, home canning was more than just a hobby. It was a way to stretch the grocery budget and keep the pantry stocked year-round. Families filled their shelves with jars of green beans, corn, and carrots, all preserved with time-tested methods passed down through generations. But while fruits and jams could be safely canned with a boiling water bath, low-acid vegetables were another story. Without a pressure cooker, those innocent-looking jars could turn into ticking time bombs for botulism. For years, many home canners relied on boiling water alone, believing that if it sealed, it was safe. Some added aspirin or vinegar, thinking it would help ward off bacteria. Others simply trusted the process. After all, their grandparents had done it. The problem? Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria behind botulism, thrives in low oxygen, low-acid environments like improperly canned vegetables. It doesn't change the taste, smell, or appearance of food, making it nearly impossible to detect until symptoms appear. As cases of botulism poisoning mounted, food safety officials began cracking down, emphasizing the need for pressure canning. So, what if I told you people actually ate monkey brains in the 50s back then? I think given the state of the rest of this list, you would probably be inclined to believe me too. But don't worry, dear viewer, I'm not going to traumatize you with elaborate descriptions of monkey minds. This was mostly just an unverified folk myth that got really popular for a few reasons. Generational discontent with the uber-wealthy, popular myths about Chinese cuisines, and a lot of over-the-top elaborate fictional propaganda by Hollywood films. I don't mean actual propaganda, but some films might have spread the idea that monkey brains were actually consumed, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The Temple of Doom and the original Indiana Jones were still really good movies, though. Don't let odd scenes with monkey brains for dessert turn you off from that. If we actually look at the facts, though, no one can really find any historical evidence for monkey brains being a solidified culinary moment in American cuisine. There would at least be super niche references to a dish if it was underground, a part of a specific culture or some kind of phenomena only in specific culinary circles, but nope, nothing comes up for monkey brains. And I thank God for that. By the 1960s, soda had become more than just a refreshing treat. It was a cultural icon. With its bold flavors, flashy advertisements, and promises of instant energy, it was a staple of American life. But some brands took that last promise a little too far. High-caffeine soda wasn't just about a quick pick-me-up. Some of these carbonated concoctions packed as much caffeine as several cups of coffee in a single bottle. At a time when regulations were still catching up to the booming food and beverage industry, caffeine content wasn't something most consumers thought to question. For those needing an extra boost, whether for a long shift, a late-night study session, or just to keep up with the fast pace of modern life, these sodas were a tempting choice. But what went down easy didn't always sit well. Excessive caffeine consumption could lead to heart palpitations, anxiety, and even dependency. Some drinkers learned the hard way that too much of a good thing wasn't always a good thing. As research into caffeine's effects grew, regulations tightened. Today, sodas still contain caffeine, but the extreme levels once found in certain brands have been curbed. Dinner parties in the 1970s had one dish that seemed to defy logic: the Savory JellO mold. A wobbly tower of gelatin, often packed with processed meats, canned vegetables, and a suspiciously artificial glow, it was a centerpiece of many tables. Whether it was ham in lime gelatin, chicken suspended in tomato aspic, or a seafood salad encased in lemon-flavored JellO, this culinary oddity was both a conversation starter and, for some, a challenge to eat. JellO molds had been around for decades, but after World War II, food companies aggressively marketed them as an easy, elegant way to serve meals. Housewives clipped recipes from magazines, creating gelatin-packed creations filled with everything from olives to pimentos. Processed meats like Spam or Bolognia often found their way into the mix, held together by gelatin and thickened with mayonnaise. It was a product of its time, efficient, visually striking, and heavy on artificial additives like food dyes and stabilizers. As food safety and nutrition research evolved, Concerns over processed meats, excessive artificial ingredients, and sodium levels grew. By the 1980s, the popularity of savory gelatin dishes faded. Today, they're more of a retro curiosity than a dinner staple. Hungry for more? Drop your favorite forgotten dish in the comments, give us a like, and subscribe for seconds.